Philippine Sea, October 24, 1944, 1400 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Yukio Seki, leader of the first official kamikaze unit, the Shinpu Special Attack Corps, watched from his Zero fighter as the massive American task force spread across the horizon like a steel city floating on water, their anti-aircraft guns already tracking his approaching formation, completely unaware that those guns now carried shells equipped with proximity fuses that would detonate within lethal range without needing to actually hit their target, a secret weapon that would transform his divine wind attack into a massacre before his pilots could even reach diving position. The Americans having solved the problem that had plagued anti-aircraft gunnery since the beginning of aerial warfare, creating shells that could think, that could sense when they were close enough to kill, that carried miniature radar sets in their nose cones broadcasting signals that bounced off approaching aircraft and triggered detonation at the perfect moment, turning near misses into kills, transforming the space around every American warship into a lethal dome of exploding steel that would destroy 70% of attacking aircraft before they could complete their suicide runs, though Seki and his pilots had no way of knowing this as they approached what they believed would be their moment of glorious sacrifice for the Emperor. The revolution in anti-aircraft warfare had begun 2 years earlier in the laboratories of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where American scientists had miniaturized vacuum tube technology enough to fit inside a 5-inch shell, creating what they called variable time fuses, VT fuses in the abbreviated language of military procurement, though the Japanese would never learn this designation, only experiencing the devastating results as their carefully planned kamikaze attacks disintegrated. In the face of unprecedented defensive firepower that seemed to pluck their aircraft from the sky with supernatural accuracy, the shells exploding not on impact but in proximity, each detonation calculated to maximize the lethal burst radius, showering attacking aircraft with thousands of steel fragments traveling at supersonic speeds, creating what American gunners called a buzz-saw effect that could shred aluminum aircraft skin from 50 feet away, turning what had been a game of precise direct hits into something far more deadly, far more efficient, far more terrifying for the attacking pilots who found themselves flying into walls of exploding steel that seemed to anticipate their every move. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had calculated that kamikaze attacks would achieve an 80% success rate based on conventional anti-aircraft capabilities, knowing that American gunners needed direct hits to bring down aircraft, that the mathematical probability of hitting a diving aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour with a conventional shell was less than 1%, making the sacrifice of his pilots a grim but effective equation where one life traded for hundreds of American sailors seemed militarily justified, but these calculations assumed the Americans were still using contact fuses, still needing that perfect intersection of shell and aircraft, not knowing that every 5-inch shell fired from American destroyers and cruisers now carried its own targeting system, its own proximity sensor, its own decision-making capability that would detonate the shell at the optimal distance to ensure maximum damage, typically within 70 feet of the target, close enough that the blast effect and fragment pattern would tear through aluminum skin and destroy engines, fuel lines, control surfaces, turning near misses into certain kills. The technology itself represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, more protected than the atomic bomb project in many ways, because while the atomic bomb was a strategic weapon whose secrets could be protected by limiting access to facilities and materials, the VT fuse was deployed on thousands of shells fired daily in combat, any one of which might fall into enemy hands if a dud landed intact, leading to extraordinary precautions including orders that VT-fused shells could only be fired over water where duds would sink, never over land where they might be recovered, and special teams assigned to destroy any American ship that might be captured to prevent the enemy from examining unexploded shells in the magazines. Precautions that proved successful as neither Germany nor Japan ever discovered the secret of the proximity fuse despite recovering numerous dud shells throughout the war, examining them without understanding that the small glass vacuum tubes they found were not just electrical components but miniature radar transmitters and receivers that could detect the presence of nearby aircraft and trigger detonation at the perfect moment. Lieutenant Yoshinori Yamaguchi, flying his Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bomber in the second wave of kamikazes approaching the American fleet, noticed something unprecedented in his attack run, watching as the aircraft ahead of him seemed to explode in mid-air without being hit, detonating 30, 40, 50 feet away from the trajectories of the American shells, as if the shells themselves could reach out and grab aircraft from the sky, and he had only seconds to process this impossible sight before his own aircraft shuddered from a nearby explosion, Not a direct hit, but close enough that the concussion wave slammed into his fuselage, followed immediately by the sound of fragments punching through his wings, his engine cowling, his cockpit glass spider webbing from impacts as he fought to maintain control, the Suisse responding sluggishly to his controls as hydraulic fluid streamed from severed lines. His carefully planned diving attack disrupted before he could even begin his final approach, forcing him to jettison his bomb and attempt to escape, though escape was impossible with his engine now trailing black smoke and his control surfaces increasingly unresponsive, the aircraft entering an uncontrolled spin that would end in the Philippine Sea 30 seconds later. The proximity fuse worked on a brilliantly simple principle that had taken years to perfect, using a continuous wave of radio signals transmitted from the nose of the shell at a frequency of 180 to 220 MHz, these signals reflecting off any nearby object and creating a Doppler shift that the fuse's receiver could detect, the changing frequency telling the fuse whether it was approaching or moving away from a target, with the detonation triggered when the rate of frequency change indicated the shell was at optimal burst distance from the aircraft, typically 20 to 30 feet for maximum fragment dispersion, though the fuse could be adjusted for different burst ranges depending on the tactical situation, and most remarkably, all of this calculation happened in the fraction of a second between the shell passing near the aircraft and the detonation command being sent to the explosive charge, a speed of decision-making that no mechanical fuse could match, no human gunner could achieve, turning every 5-inch gun into a smart weapon decades before that term would enter military vocabulary. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served as a senior staff officer analyzing American defensive capabilities, received the first reports of the catastrophic losses during kamikaze operations with disbelief, the numbers seeming impossible, 70% of aircraft destroyed before reaching their targets, entire squadrons eliminated in seconds, experienced pilots who had survived conventional anti-aircraft fire for years suddenly unable to penetrate American defensive screens, and his analysis of the attack patterns revealed something deeply disturbing, that the Americans weren't just shooting better, they were shooting differently, their shells detonating in patterns that suggested they knew exactly where each aircraft would be, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach routes, no gaps in coverage that skilled pilots could exploit, as if the Americans had suddenly gained the ability to see a few seconds into the future and place their shells exactly where they needed to be. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun, the standard dual-purpose weapon on American destroyers and cruisers, had been transformed from a moderately effective anti-aircraft weapon into a devastating aerial defense system by the addition of the VT fuse, each shell now capable of creating a lethal burst radius of 70 feet, meaning that instead of needing to score a direct hit on a target perhaps 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, the gunner only needed to place the shell within 70 feet of the aircraft, expanding the effective target area by a factor of 50, and when combined with the radar-directed fire control systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously and predict their future positions based on speed and heading, the result was a defensive capability that made traditional mass attack tactics suicidal, forcing Japanese planners to reconsider every aspect of their kamikaze strategy, though they had no understanding of why American defenses had suddenly become so lethal. The development of the proximity fuse had required solving numerous technical challenges that seemed insurmountable when the project began in 1940, starting with the need to create electronic components that could survive being fired from a gun, experiencing acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity that would destroy conventional vacuum tubes, requiring the development of special ruggedized tubes with reinforced glass envelopes and shock-mounted internal components, then ensuring these components could function reliably after experiencing the trauma of launch, the intense spin imparted by the gun's rifling, the temperature extremes of high-altitude flight, and still maintain the precise calibration needed to detect and respond to reflected radio signals, problems that took thousands of hours of testing to solve, including bizarre solutions like filling the tubes with wax to prevent components from shifting during acceleration and using special battery designs that would only activate after being fired, preventing premature battery drain during storage. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, creator of the Kamikaze Corps, had based his entire strategy on mathematical certainty, calculating that if Japan could trade one pilot and one aircraft for one American warship, the exchange rate would favor Japan because America could not replace ships as quickly as Japan could train suicide pilots, especially given the simplified training required for a one-way mission compared to conventional attack pilots who needed to learn how to return and land. But these calculations assumed a success rate of at least 50%, preferably higher, and the reports now reaching him from the Philippines indicated success rates below 10%, sometimes as low as 5%, meaning Japan was trading 10 pilots and 10 aircraft for one American ship, sometimes 20 pilots for one ship, an exchange rate that meant the kamikaze strategy was not just failing but accelerating Japan's defeat by consuming pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate while inflicting minimal damage on the American fleet. The shells themselves were marvels of miniaturization, containing in their nose cones a complete radio transceiver system powered by a battery that activated upon firing, the entire assembly weighing less than 2 pounds and small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet sophisticated enough to discriminate between legitimate targets and false returns from waves, rain, or clouds, using a combination of signal strength and Doppler shift to determine whether the reflected signal came from an aircraft-sized object moving at aircraft speeds, rejecting returns from slower-moving objects like birds or stationary objects like clouds. All of these calculations performed by analog circuits using vacuum tubes that had to function perfectly after experiencing the violence of being fired from a gun. A level of reliability that pushed 1940s technology to its absolute limits and required quality control standards that exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, leading a flight of 24 kamikaze aircraft from the 201st Air Group, experienced the full devastating effect of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire during an attack on Task Force 38 off Leyte Gulf, watching his formation disintegrate around him as shells exploded with impossible accuracy. Not the random bursts of conventional anti-aircraft fire that might catch an unlucky pilot, but targeted detonations that seemed to know exactly where each aircraft would be. His pilots reporting over radio in their final seconds that shells were exploding above them, below them, beside them, all at the perfect distance to maximize damage. And Nakajima himself survived only because his aircraft was hit early in the approach, forcing him to abort before entering the main kill zone where the concentration of VT-fused fire was heaviest, limping back to base with half his vertical stabilizer shot away, and his account of the attack adding to the growing Japanese bewilderment about American defensive capabilities. The proximity fuse transformed the mathematics of naval anti-aircraft defense in ways that Japanese tacticians couldn't comprehend without understanding the technology involved, as traditional anti-aircraft theory assumed that defensive fire created a statistical barrier where a certain percentage of attacking aircraft would be destroyed based on the volume of fire and the skill of the gunners. But VT fuses changed this from a statistical problem to a targeting problem, where each shell had a high probability of destroying any aircraft within its burst radius, meaning that defensive fire could be concentrated on specific targets with confidence that near misses would still be effective, allowing American ships to engage multiple targets simultaneously without wasting ammunition on barrage fire, fundamentally changing the defensive equation from trying to fill the sky with enough steel that some aircraft would run into it to deliberately targeting and destroying specific aircraft with aimed fire that didn't require perfect accuracy. The secret of the VT fuse was so closely guarded that even most American naval officers didn't fully understand how it worked, knowing only that the new shells were far more effective than the old ones, with gunners reporting that they could see enemy aircraft exploding when shells passed near them, creating an almost supernatural effect that boosted American morale as much as it devastated Japanese attackers, and the strict security protocols meant that no VT-fused shells were used over land until late 1944, when the military concluded that the Germans were too pressed to exploit any captured technology, and even then only in desperate situations like the Battle of the Bulge where the advantage outweighed the security risk, maintaining the secret so effectively that German intelligence never identified the proximity fuse as a significant technology despite its widespread use in the Pacific. Admiral Matomagaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet and one of the principal architects of kamikaze operations, noted in his diary the inexplicable improvement in American anti-aircraft effectiveness, writing that the enemy's defensive fire has become impossibly accurate, as if they can predict where our aircraft will be and place their shells there in advance, though he attributed this to improved radar and fire control rather than imagining that the shells themselves had become intelligent, and his efforts to develop countermeasures focused on traditional solutions like approaching at different altitudes, using cloud cover, or attacking at dawn and dusk when visibility was limited, none of which addressed the fundamental problem that American shells no longer needed to hit their targets to destroy them, that proximity was enough, that the killing zone around each American ship had expanded exponentially without any visible change in the number or type of guns. The VT fuse production program represented one of the most remarkable industrial achievements of the war, requiring the manufacture of millions of complex electronic devices under tolerances that would have seemed impossible before the war, with each fuse containing components that had to survive forces that would destroy a normal radio, yet still function with enough sensitivity to detect the weak reflected signals from an aircraft, leading to innovations in manufacturing that would later contribute to the post-war electronics revolution, including techniques for mass-producing miniaturized components, quality control systems that could test millions of units efficiently, and production line methods that could maintain precision while operating at high speed, with American factories eventually producing VT fuses at a rate of 40,000 per day by 1945, each one representing a potential aircraft kill, a saved American ship, a Japanese pilot whose sacrifice would be in vain. Commander Isachi Tamai, who had trained many of the kamikaze pilots, received reports from the few survivors who managed to return after failed attacks, their accounts consistently describing shells that seemed to explode at the perfect distance to cause maximum damage. Not the random patterns of conventional anti-aircraft fire but deliberate, aimed detonations that suggested the Americans had developed some new form of ammunition, though neither Tamai nor any other Japanese officer could imagine the true nature of the technology, assuming instead that American gunners had simply become incredibly skilled or that new fire control systems allowed better prediction of aircraft paths, never considering that the shells themselves might contain active sensing equipment that could detect aircraft and determine the optimal detonation point, a concept that seemed like science fiction even to engineers familiar with radar technology. The psychological impact of the VT fuse on Japanese pilots was devastating even beyond the physical destruction it caused, as pilots who had trained for months preparing for their final mission found themselves dying without glory, without even reaching their targets, their sacrifice meaningless as they exploded in midair far from any American ship, and the few who survived aborted attacks reported a sense of helplessness, of facing a defense that seemed supernatural in its effectiveness. Shells that could think, that could see them coming, that knew exactly when to explode for maximum effect, creating a crisis of morale that undermined the spiritual foundation of the kamikaze program, which required pilots to believe their sacrifice would achieve something meaningful, would damage the enemy, would contribute to Japan's defense, not simply die in vain against an impenetrable wall of intelligent ammunition. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun mount Mark 12, the standard dual-purpose gun on American destroyers, could fire 15 rounds per minute with VT fuses, each round creating a lethal zone 70 feet in radius, meaning a single destroyer with 5 mounts could create 75 lethal zones per minute, or 1,125 lethal zones in the 15 minutes of a typical kamikaze approach, and when multiplied by the dozens of destroyers in a typical task force screen. Plus, the cruisers with their 6-inch and 8-inch guns also firing VT-fused shells, plus the battleships with their 5-inch secondary batteries. The result was an impenetrable dome of exploding steel that no amount of courage or determination could overcome, forcing Japanese planners to resort to increasingly desperate measures like rocket-powered Oka suicide missiles that could approach at speeds too fast for conventional tracking, though even these proved vulnerable to VT-fused fire when they had to slow down for terminal guidance. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, senior staff officer for the 1st Air Fleet, conducted detailed analysis of kamikaze operations and concluded by November 1944 that something fundamental had changed in American defensive capabilities, noting that loss rates had increased from 30% in early operations to over 70% by the end of October, with some attacks experiencing 100% losses, entire squadrons of 20 or 30 aircraft destroyed without a single one reaching its target, and his recommendation that kamikaze operations be suspended until a solution could be found was rejected by higher command, who insisted that the spiritual power of the kamikaze would eventually overcome any material disadvantage. Refusing to accept that American technology had made the entire concept obsolete, that no amount of courage could overcome the physics of proximity-fused shells creating overlapping fields of lethal fragments. The battle for Okinawa in April 1945 demonstrated the full devastating potential of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire, with the Japanese launching Operation Tengo, sending waves of over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft against the American invasion fleet in a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the battle, but the American defenses, now fully equipped with VT fuses and experienced in their use, created a defensive performance that stunned even American commanders, with destroyer picket lines shooting down attacking aircraft at ranges previously thought impossible, some ships reporting kill rates of 90% against attacking formations, the sky around the fleet filled with the constant explosion of VT-fused shells and the debris of destroyed Japanese aircraft, creating what one American sailor described as a dome of death that nothing could penetrate. though the Japanese continued their attacks with decreasing effectiveness until they had exhausted their aircraft reserves. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who had led that first official kamikaze attack in October 1944, never learned about the proximity fuse, dying when his Zero exploded 70 feet from the escort carrier USS St. Lo, close enough that his sacrifice seemed successful as the carrier was hit by another kamikaze that had somehow penetrated the defensive screen. But Seki's death represented the beginning of a campaign that would see over 3,000 Japanese pilots die in kamikaze attacks, the vast majority killed by VT-fused anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets, their sacrifice achieving far less than conventional torpedo bomber attacks would have accomplished. A tragic irony that Japanese commanders would only understand after the war when American technical intelligence officers explained the secret of the proximity fuse, the simple radio device that had turned their divine wind into a futile gesture against American technological superiority. The miniaturization required for the VT fuse pushed American electronics technology forward by years, requiring innovations that would later prove essential for the development of transistors and integrated circuits, as engineers learned to create robust electronic devices that could survive extreme conditions while maintaining precise calibration, developing manufacturing techniques for producing millions of complex devices with consistent quality, creating quality control systems that could identify defects in components smaller than a fingernail, and perhaps most importantly, proving that electronics could be made reliable enough for combat conditions, that vacuum tubes didn't have to be fragile laboratory instruments but could be engineered to survive the most extreme conditions imaginable. Lessons that would transform post-war electronics from unreliable experimental devices to the robust consumer products that would define the modern age. Admiral Somu Toyota would later testify to American interrogators that the sudden increase in anti-aircraft effectiveness had been completely unexpected, that Japanese planning had assumed American defenses would improve gradually through better training and more guns, not through a revolutionary technology that made existing tactics obsolete overnight, and he admitted that if Japan had known about the proximity fuse, they would never have adopted the kamikaze strategy, would have conserved their pilots for conventional operations where skill and training might still make a difference, rather than sending them to certain death against a defense they couldn't understand or counter. A defense that turned their aircraft into targets the moment they entered radar range, that made their sacrifice meaningless before they even began their final dive. The proximity fuse remained secret throughout the war despite millions being fired in combat, a testament to both American security procedures and Japanese intelligence failures, as the Japanese recovered numerous dud shells but never recognized the significance of the small electronic components inside, assuming they were some sort of timing device or safety mechanism rather than active sensing equipment. And even when Japanese technicians noticed the unusual construction with vacuum tubes and batteries, they couldn't imagine these components surviving the shock of being fired from a gun. Couldn't conceive that Americans had solved the engineering challenges required to make electronics that robust, remaining convinced until after the war that American anti-aircraft effectiveness came from better training, better radar, better fire control, everything except the truth that the shells themselves had become intelligent. Commander Fukuda, analyzing the failure of kamikaze operations after the war, identified the proximity fuse as the single most important factor in American defensive success, calculating that without VT fuses, kamikaze attacks would have achieved success rates of 40 to 50% instead of the 5 to 10% actually experienced, potentially sinking dozens more American ships and killing thousands more sailors, possibly prolonging the war by months as America would have had to adopt different tactics to protect their fleet. But the VT fuse had made kamikaze attacks not just ineffective but counterproductive, consuming Japanese aircraft and pilots at an unsustainable rate while achieving minimal results, accelerating Japan's defeat rather than preventing it, turning what might have been a successful desperate strategy into a tragic waste of lives. The cost of the VT fuse program, approximately $1 billion in 1940s currency, represented one of the largest technical investments of the war after the Manhattan Project. But the return on investment was extraordinary, with Navy analysts calculating that VT fuses increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 5, saving hundreds of ships and thousands of lives that would have been lost to kamikaze attacks, making it possibly the most cost-effective weapons program of the entire war when measured in lives saved and strategic impact, though these calculations couldn't capture the psychological effect on both sides. The boost to American morale from having an effective defense against suicide attacks and the corresponding devastation to Japanese morale when their ultimate sacrifice proved futile against American technology. The VT fuse technology was so advanced that even after examining captured examples after the war, Japanese engineers admitted they couldn't have duplicated it with their available technology and manufacturing capabilities. As Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to mass-produce miniaturized electronics, the quality control systems to ensure reliability, and most importantly, the basic research that had led to the breakthrough innovations required for the proximity fuse, highlighting the technological gap that had developed between America and Japan during the war, a gap that went beyond just having better weapons to having entirely different categories of weapons that Japan couldn't match or counter, weapons that seemed to violate the basic assumptions of warfare, like shells that could think, that could decide when to explode, that didn't need to hit their target to destroy it. Vice Admiral Onishi, before his suicide on August 16, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender, left a note apologizing to the approximately 4,000 pilots who had died in kamikaze attacks, acknowledging that their sacrifice had been in vain, though he never knew about the proximity fuse that had made their deaths meaningless, never understood that American technology had doomed his strategy from the beginning, that no amount of spiritual power could overcome the simple physics of radio. Waves reflecting off aluminum aircraft skin and triggering an explosion at the perfect distance to maximize destruction. A triumph of engineering over ideology that would define the post-war world where technology increasingly determined military outcomes regardless of human courage or determination. The operational security surrounding the VT fuse was so complete that even American forces didn't fully understand its capabilities, with many gunners believing they had simply become better shots, not realizing their shells were doing the aiming for them, and this secrecy extended to Allied forces, with British and Australian naval officers expressing amazement at American anti-aircraft effectiveness without being told the secret, leading to occasional frustration when Allied ships couldn't match American performance despite using the same guns and fire control systems, not knowing they lacked the one crucial component that made the difference, the small electronic device in the nose of each shell that turned near misses into kills, that made every gunner an expert marksman, that created an invisible shield around American task forces. Captain Iniguchi's post-war analysis identified specific battles where the VT fuse had been decisive, particularly the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American carriers shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft with minimal losses, a turkey shoot that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force, and he noted that Japanese pilots had reported shells exploding in perfect patterns around their formations, creating walls of fragments that no amount of evasive maneuvering could avoid, though at the time Japanese commanders attributed this to lucky shooting rather than recognizing that American shells were actively tracking their aircraft, measuring the distance, calculating the optimal detonation point, making decisions faster than any human could process, turning the battle into a technological mismatch that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome. The 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns that formed the close in defense of American ships didn't use VT fuses, as the shells were too small to contain the necessary electronics, but the 5-inch guns with VT fuses proved so effective at medium range that many kamikaze aircraft never reached the range of these smaller weapons, creating a layered defense where the VT-fused 5-inch guns engaged targets at maximum range, destroying most attackers before they could begin their final dive, with the rapid-fire smaller guns handling any leakers that somehow penetrated the outer screen, though these leakers were usually already damaged by near misses from VT-fused shells, trailing smoke, losing altitude, their control surfaces shredded by fragments, making them easy targets for the concentrated fire of 20mm and 40mm guns. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima, one of the few kamikaze leaders to survive the war, testified that the mysterious improvement in American anti-aircraft fire had demoralized his pilots even before they took off, as word spread through the squadrons that attacking American ships had become almost impossible, that shells seemed to know where aircraft would be, that the Americans had developed some secret weapon that made conventional attack tactics useless, creating a sense of futility that undermined the spiritual preparation essential for kamikaze operations, as pilots found it harder to maintain their resolve when they knew their death would likely be meaningless, exploding in empty air far from their target, their sacrifice achieving nothing except adding to the mounting toll of Japanese losses that everyone could see was unsustainable. The proximity fuse represented more than just a technical achievement, embodying the American approach to warfare that emphasized technological solutions over human sacrifice, finding ways to make machines do what other nations asked their soldiers to do, creating smart weapons that could make decisions faster and better than humans, And this philosophy would define American military development for the rest of the 20th century, from guided missiles to smart bombs to automated defense systems, all tracing their lineage back to the VT Fuze, the first smart weapon, the first time a projectile could think for itself, could decide when to detonate for maximum effect, proving that technology could be more decisive than courage, that innovation could overcome determination, that the side with better science would likely win the war. Admiral Igaki's final diary entry before his own kamikaze flight on August 15, 1945, mentioned the inexplicable effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire, wondering what secret the Americans possessed that made their guns so deadly, never knowing that the answer was contained in the nose cone of every 5-inch shell, a marvel of miniaturized electronics that could detect his aircraft from 70 feet away and trigger an explosion that would fill the air with thousands of steel fragments. Anyone of which could tear through aluminum skin, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, destroy engines, kill pilots, that his death, like so many others, would be determined not by the skill of American gunners, but by the cold calculation of vacuum tubes and circuits processing radio signals at the speed of light. The legacy of the VT Fuze extended far beyond World War II, establishing principles of smart weaponry that would revolutionize warfare, proving that adding intelligence to ammunition could multiply combat effectiveness beyond what anyone had imagined, that the future of warfare lay not in building more guns or training better gunners but in making each projectile capable of independent decision-making, and the engineers who had solved the impossible problem of making electronics survive being fired from a gun had inadvertently created the foundation for every smart weapon that followed, from heat-seeking missiles to laser-guided bombs to modern proximity-fused ammunition that can distinguish between different types of targets. All descendants of that first VT Fuze that turned the tide against kamikaze attacks. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the proximity fuse because they never understood what they were facing, attempting solutions that address symptoms rather than causes, like approaching from different angles or at different speeds, not realizing that the fuses could adapt to any approach angle, any speed, any altitude, as long as the aircraft came within detection range, and their increasingly desperate tactics, like using faster aircraft or approaching at wave-top height only, marginally improved success rates while dramatically increasing operational losses from accidents and fuel exhaustion, creating a death spiral where each failed attack required more extreme tactics that produced more losses without achieving better results, all because they were fighting against a technology they didn't know existed. Commander Tamai's training program for kamikaze pilots had emphasized spiritual preparation over tactical innovation, believing that pure spirit and determination would overcome any material obstacle. But the proximity fuse represented a material obstacle that no amount of spirit could overcome, a technology that negated human courage by making sacrifice futile, and the gradual realization among Japanese pilots that their deaths would likely be meaningless, that they would explode in empty air, without even seeing their target, created a crisis that Tamai couldn't address because he didn't understand the cause, couldn't explain to his pilots why American defenses had suddenly become impenetrable, could only urge greater spiritual dedication against an enemy that had transcended the spiritual battlefield entirely, replacing courage with calculation, sacrifice with science. The production statistics for VT fuses revealed the scale of American industrial mobilization, with factories producing over 22 million proximity fuses during the war, each one hand-assembled and tested, requiring a workforce trained in precision electronics assembly, a quality control system that could detect microscopic defects, and a supply chain that could deliver exotic materials like special glass for vacuum tubes and precise electronic components, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about what was being produced, with workers told only that they were making special ammunition, not knowing they were creating the first smart weapons, the first ammunition that could think, that their work would save thousands of American lives by making kamikaze attacks futile. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the ultimate effectiveness of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire, with American forces shooting down over 900 kamikaze aircraft while losing only 36 ships, most to the few kamikazes that managed to penetrate the defensive screen, a loss ratio that would have been reversed without proximity fuses, as traditional anti-aircraft fire would have stopped perhaps 30% of attackers instead of 70%, meaning hundreds more ships would have been hit, thousands more sailors killed, potentially making the invasion of Okinawa impossible to sustain, forcing American commanders to reconsider their entire Pacific strategy. But the VT Fuze had made the kamikaze threat manageable, expensive in ships and lives but not catastrophic. Not enough to stop the inexorable American advance toward Japan. Lieutenant Seki's death in the first official kamikaze attack had been portrayed as a glorious sacrifice that would inspire thousands to follow. But the reality experienced by those followers was far different from the propaganda, as they faced not the heroic battle against American ships described in Japanese newspapers but a technological slaughter where they died without dignity, without achieving anything, their aircraft transformed into expanding clouds of aluminum fragments by shells that exploded at precisely calculated distances. Their bodies never recovered, their sacrifice unmemorialized except as statistics in American action reports noting the number of aircraft destroyed by VT-fused fire, the proximity fuse having transformed their divine wind into nothing more than target practice for American gunners whose shells could think faster than any pilot could react. The secret of the proximity fuse would remain classified until after the war, when American technical intelligence officers finally explained to Japanese engineers what they had faced, showing them the miniaturized electronics that had made kamikaze attacks futile, and the Japanese reaction was one of amazement mixed with resignation, understanding finally why their desperate strategy had failed so completely, why their pilots had died in such numbers without achieving corresponding damage. Why American anti-aircraft fire had seemed supernatural in its effectiveness, the revelation that a simple radio device smaller than a sake bottle had negated their entire strategy, had made their ultimate sacrifice meaningless, representing a level of technological disadvantage they hadn't imagined possible. A gap between nations that could only widen as electronics became increasingly central to warfare. Admiral Toyoda's post-war reflection on the kamikaze campaign acknowledged that Japan had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare, had believed that spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage, that the purity of sacrifice could defeat superior technology. But the proximity fuse had proven this calculation wrong, had shown that technology could create advantages that no amount of human courage could overcome, that a small electronic device could negate the sacrifice of thousands of trained pilots, and his admission that Japan would never have adopted kamikaze tactics if they had known about the VT fuse represented not just a tactical revelation but a philosophical one, an acknowledgement that the age of warrior spirit had ended, replaced by the age of technological supremacy where victory went not to the most courageous but to the most scientifically advanced. The effectiveness of the VT fuse created a paradox for American forces, as the very success of the weapon meant that few sailors actually understood why their anti-aircraft fire had become so effective, attributing their success to better training or improved fire control rather than recognizing that their shells had become intelligent. And this misunderstanding persisted even after the war, with many veterans never learning about the proximity fuse, never knowing that their survival during kamikaze attacks had depended on a secret weapon that turned near misses into kills, that made every gunner an expert marksman, that created an invisible electronic shield around their ships that no amount of Japanese courage could penetrate, the secret protected so well that even those whose lives it saved didn't know it existed. The final kamikaze attacks of August 1945, launched even after the atomic bombs had been dropped, faced the full development of American VT fuse technology, with improved versions that could discriminate between single aircraft and formations, that could adjust their sensitivity based on the size of the reflected signal, that could function in heavy rain and fog that would have blinded optical gunners, creating a defensive capability that made these last desperate attacks completely futile, with loss rates approaching 100%, the few surviving pilots reporting that American shells seemed to anticipate their every move, exploding in perfect patterns that left no escape route, no possibility of reaching their targets. The proximity fuse having evolved from a simple radio detector to a sophisticated targeting system that made human pilots obsolete in the face of electronic warfare. Vice Admiral Onishi's suicide note, apologizing to the kamikaze pilots who had died under his command, represented the human cost of technological mismatch, of sending men to die against a defense they couldn't understand or overcome, and while he never knew about the proximity fuse that had doomed his strategy, his recognition that the kamikaze campaign had failed, that the sacrifice of 4,000 pilots had achieved little strategic impact, reflected the reality that technology had made their courage irrelevant, their determination meaningless, their sacrifice futile, the VT fuse having transformed warfare from a contest of human will to a calculation of electronic circuits, from battlefield courage to laboratory innovation, from the age of warriors to the age of engineers who could create weapons that thought faster than humans could react. The proximity fuse achieved what no amount of propaganda or morale building could accomplish, making American sailors confident they could survive kamikaze attacks, that their ships possessed an almost magical defense against suicide attackers, and this confidence proved self-reinforcing, as gunners who believed their weapons were effective performed better, maintained their positions under attack, continued firing even as kamikazes approached, knowing that their shells would find their targets, that near misses counted, that the electronic brains in each projectile would calculate the perfect moment to detonate, creating a psychological advantage that amplified the technical advantage, making American defenses even more effective than the pure mathematics of the proximity fuse would suggest. Though neither American sailors nor Japanese pilots understood the true nature of the technology that had transformed the Pacific War's final act into a one-sided slaughter where courage meant nothing against circuits that could think at the speed of light.